The cold rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the mountain roads of the Serchio River Valley into ribbons of thick mud that clung to everything. Private First Class Isaiah Williams crouched in a foxhole carved into the slope of a nameless hill. His wool uniform soaked through, the fabric stiff and heavy against his skin. November in northern Italy wasn't supposed to be like this. Someone had told him the Mediterranean was warm, that Italian winters were mild. But here in the Apennines, the wind cut through the valleys like a blade, and the rain never seemed to stop. It was November 23rd, 1944, Thanksgiving Day. Isaiah looked down at his hands. Black skin turned gray in the dim light, fingernails rimmed with dirt and dried blood that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard he scrubbed. His rifle lay across his lap, the metal cold even through his gloves. Somewhere below, in the valley where the morning fog still clung to the earth like smoke, German positions waited. They'd been fighting for this ground since October, taking a hill one day, losing it the next. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, the only colored division in the European theater to see real combat. And they were bleeding for every yard of Italian soil. The foxhole smelled of wet earth and gunpowder residue, of unwashed bodies and fear. Isaiah had shared this hole with Private Thomas Green for the past 2 weeks, taking turns at watch, huddling together for warmth when the temperature dropped at night. But Green was gone now, killed by a mortar around 4 days ago while bringing up ammunition. Isaiah had watched him fall, had seen the look of surprise on Green's face in that final instant before the light went out of his eyes. They'd buried him in a shallow grave up the ridge, marked with a wooden cross and his dog tags. Another Buffalo soldier who would never see home again. The mountains around them were ancient and unforgiving, their slopes thick with chestnut trees and scrub oak that provided cover for German snipers. In the valleys between the ridges, stone farmhouses stood empty and damaged. Their red tile roofs collapsed, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Italian civilians had fled weeks ago, abandoning centuries-old olive groves and terraced vineyards to the advancing armies. Now only the armies remained, locked in a brutal struggle for ground that seemed to matter only because men were dying for it. Isaiah shifted his weight, feeling water squelch in his boots. His feet had been wet for so long that the skin had gone soft and pale, the beginnings of trench foot creeping in despite his best efforts to keep dry. Every soldier in the company was fighting the same battle against the elements, against the constant cold and damp that sapped strength and will. Some had already been evacuated with pneumonia or severe frostbite. Others just endured because that's what soldiers did. Footsteps sloshed through the mud behind him. Corporal James Turner appeared at the edge of the foxhole, his face gaunt beneath his helmet, eyes sunken from too many nights without sleep. He whispered the word that would pass from foxhole to foxhole along the line, formation at Ohite 100, and something about Thanksgiving dinner. Turkey, Turner said, though the word sounded strange in his mouth, like a memory from another life. After Turner moved on, Isaiah sat in the foxhole and tried to remember what turkey tasted like. It had been 2 years since he'd left Georgia. 2 years since his last real Thanksgiving at his mama's table. She'd cooked a bird that year, somehow scraping together the ration stamps, and they'd had sweet potatoes and greens and cornbread that melted in your mouth. His little sister had said grace, her voice high and clear, thanking God for family and for the hope that Isaiah would come home safe. His father had carved the turkey with hands still calloused from 40 years of farm work, hands that had picked cotton and tobacco under the Georgia's sun. Hands that had known the weight of injustice and had borne it with quiet dignity. Those same hands had gripped Isaiah's shoulders the day he left for training, and his father had looked him in the eye and said only, "Make us proud, son. Show them what we're made of." Isaiah thought about that farm in rural Georgia, the wood frame house with its sagging porch and rusted tin roof. He thought about the red clay roads and the pine forests, the sound of church bells on Sunday morning, the smell of his mama's cooking drifting through the evening air. He thought about the colored section of town where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors looked out for each other because they had to, because the white world beyond wouldn't. He'd been working at the sawmill when his draft notice came, earning 20 cents an hour cutting pine boards. He'd reported to the Colored Induction Center in Atlanta, where they'd processed him with the same efficiency they processed white boys, but kept them carefully separate. Even the buses that took them to training had been segregated, colored soldiers in the back, always in the back. He wondered what his family was eating today. Whether they were gathered around that same table, whether his mama had managed to find a turkey or was making do with chicken or rabbit, whether his little sister, who must be 14 now, still said grace with that same pure voice, whether they were praying for him, asking God to bring him home whole. The rain kept falling, drumming against his helmet, running in rivulets down his neck. At Ohite 100, What was left of C Company assembled in a clearing behind the front line. There were maybe 60 men where there should have been 180. The others were dead, wounded, or missing. Isaiah stood in formation with the rest, water running off his helmet in steady streams, pooling in his boots. His feet had been wet for so long he couldn't remember what dry felt like. The clearing had once been part of a vineyard, the gnarled stumps of grapevines still visible among the shell craters and churned mud. A stone wall ran along one edge, half collapsed from artillery fire. Beyond it, through the mist and rain, the dark shapes of mountains rose like the humped backs of sleeping giants. The men stood in loose ranks, too tired and too cold to maintain the rigid formations of parade grounds. They wore whatever they could find to stay warm, wool scarves wrapped around necks, captured German gloves, canvas shelter halves draped over shoulders. Some had cigarettes dangling from their lips, the smoke mixing with their breath in the cold air. Others just stared at the ground, conserving energy, waiting. Captain Henderson stood before them, a white officer from Alabama with a thin mustache and eyes that never quite met theirs. Behind him stood the division commander, Major General Edward Almond, a man whose reputation preceded him like a thundercloud. Almond believed colored troops couldn't fight, had said as much in reports, had blamed every setback on the men rather than on the impossible terrain or the well-entrenched Germans or the chronic shortage of supplies that plagued every unit in Italy. He stood now with his arms already crossed, his posture rigid, looking at the assembled soldiers as if cataloging their deficiencies. Henderson's drawl was thick as molasses as he delivered the news. The army had made arrangements. Every soldier in the European theater would receive a proper turkey dinner, a gift from a grateful nation. The supply convoy would arrive at 1600 hours. C Company would rotate off the line first, get hot food, turkey with all the fixings, time to clean up and rest. A ripple went through the formation, men shifting their weight, glancing at each other. Isaiah saw Sergeant Washington in the front row, his jaw tight, his hands clenched behind his back. Washington was a career soldier, had been in the army since before the war, and he knew better than most what promises from white officers were worth. General Almond said nothing, just stood there with his arms crossed, looking at them like they were a problem he was trying to solve, like they were equipment that wasn't performing to specification. After the formation broke, the men gathered in small groups, voices low. Private Marcus Johnson, who'd worked the Ford plant in Detroit before the war, spoke what they were all thinking. Private Willie Reed from Mississippi, who'd been a sharecropper, said he'd believe it when he saw it. They'd been promised equality when they put on these uniforms. Still waiting on that, too. Isaiah stood with them, saying nothing. He was thinking about German prisoners of war he'd seen in camp last week being transported through their sector. The prisoners had ridden in trucks while colored soldiers had to march. The prisoners had been given clean uniforms while the Buffalo soldiers wore whatever they could salvage. He'd heard stories, too, about German POs being allowed to eat in restaurants where colored soldiers were turned away. Fighting for a country that wouldn't let you sit at a lunch counter. Fighting for freedom you'd never have. The irony burned like acid in his gut. Here they were, thousands of miles from home, bleeding and dying to defeat fascism, to stop Hitler's vision of a master race. And yet their own army treated them as inferior, kept them in segregated units under white officers who often held the same racial views as the enemy they were fighting. The contradiction was so stark, so painful, that Isaiah sometimes wondered if anyone back home understood what they were going through, if anyone cared. He remembered a story that had circulated through the ranks a few weeks back. A colored soldier from another division had been beaten by MPs for using a whites-only latrine at a supply depot. The same day, German POs had been allowed to use that same facility without incident. The German prisoners, the very men who had been shooting at American soldiers hours before, were treated better than the Americans who wore the same uniform and carried the same flag. It was a pattern Isaiah had witnessed repeatedly since shipping out. At the base in Virginia before deployment, German POs worked in the mess hall and were served alongside white American soldiers while the colored troops ate in a separate building. On the transport ship to Italy, German prisoners bunked in heated compartments while colored soldiers slept in the hold. Even here in Italy, he'd seen German POs get hot meals and medical care that seemed to arrive faster than supplies for the Buffalo soldiers. The message was clear, even if no one said it out loud, in the eyes of many white Americans. A German prisoner was more deserving of dignity than a colored American soldier. Sergeant Washington joined them, water running down the deep lines of his face. He was 35, old for an infantry sergeant, with a wife and 3 children back in Louisiana. He'd been with the division since Fort Huachuca, had trained in the Arizona desert heat, had seen how the white officers treated them, had kept his head down and his mouth shut because that was how you survived. But now he spoke, and his voice carried a weight that made the men listen. He didn't care if it was turkey or rations in a can. What mattered was they were alive to eat it. What mattered was they were together. They would sit down today and have their Thanksgiving. They would remember who they were and why they were here. When Willie Reed asked why they were really here, the question hung in the rain-soaked air. Washington was quiet for a long moment, the rain pattering against their helmets, against the canvas tents behind them, against the mud that was everywhere. They were here because somebody had to be, he finally said. Because if they didn't fight, Hitler won. If Hitler wins, the whole world would look like Mississippi on a bad day. They were here because maybe when they went home, people would have to look at them different, would have to see they bled the same as anybody else. Isaiah wanted to believe that. God, how he wanted to believe it. The morning passed slowly. They stayed in position, scanning the valley for movement, listening for the sound of German artillery. At noon, someone passed around a rumor that the supply convoy had been delayed. At 1400, word came that it was stuck in the mud 15 miles south. The men accepted this news with the weary resignation of soldiers who'd learned not to expect anything good. But at 1530, just as the gray afternoon was fading toward an early dusk, they heard the sound of engines grinding up the mountain road. Isaiah was on watch when he saw them coming. 3 deuce-and-a-half trucks laboring up the slope, wheels spinning in the mud, exhaust rising in black clouds. The lead truck had a white canvas cover stretched over its bed, tied down tight against the rain. Behind it came a water truck and a field kitchen trailer, the chimney pipe jutting up like a crooked finger. Marcus Johnson stood beside Isaiah, both of them watching in something close to disbelief. The convoy had actually come. The truck stopped in the clearing, engines idling, and colored soldiers from the Quartermaster Corps jumped down from the cabs. They wore cleaner uniforms than the infantry, their boots less caked with mud. But their faces showed the same exhaustion that marked every soldier in Italy. They moved quickly, efficiently, setting up the field kitchen, arranging long wooden tables under canvas tarps strung between trees. Steam rose from the pots as they opened them, the smell of cooking food drifting through the rain-soaked camp. It was turkey. Real turkey. The smell hit Isaiah like a physical force, awakening a hunger he'd been suppressing for months. It wasn't just the aroma of roasted meat, though that alone was enough to make his mouth water. It was the smell of civilization, of normalcy, of a world that existed beyond mud and death and endless rain. It was the smell of home. C Company assembled again, no longer in formation but in a loose crowd, men pressing forward to see. Soldiers emerged from foxholes and tents, drawn by the impossible sight of a real Thanksgiving meal. Some moved slowly, stiffly, nursing injuries or exhaustion. Others came quickly, eagerly, unable to believe their eyes. A supply sergeant stood on the back of the truck, his voice carrying across the clearing as he called out what they had. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. They would eat like they were back home. The men moved forward, grabbing their mess kits. The cooks served generous portions, spooning the hot food into the metal trays. Isaiah held out his mess kit and watched as a Quartermaster Corps private piled turkey and stuffing onto it, the steam rising into his face. The private was young, maybe 19, with kind eyes and a slight smile. He gave Isaiah an extra scoop of potatoes, a small kindness that somehow meant everything. He found a spot under one of the canvas tarps, sitting on an empty ammunition crate. Around him, the men of C Company found their own places. Some sitting on crates, some on the ground, some leaning against the trucks. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of eating, a fork scraping against metal, of men who'd been hungry for longer than they could remember finally getting something good. The turkey was warm. It tasted like home. Isaiah closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in Georgia, sitting at his mama's table, his sister laughing at something their father had said. He could almost hear the sound of gospel music playing on the radio, could almost smell the pine smoke from the wood stove. He could feel the worn wood of the chair beneath him, could see the flowered tablecloth his mama brought out for special occasions, could taste the sweet potato pie that would come after the meal. When he opened his eyes, he was still in Italy, still in the rain, still at war. But for this moment, with hot food in his belly and his brothers around him, the war felt distant. The fear that lived in his chest every waking moment loosened its grip just slightly. He took another bite of turkey, savoring the texture, the flavor, the simple act of eating real food. Around him, he could see the same transformation happening to the other men. Faces that had been hard and closed were softening. Shoulders that had been hunched against the cold and fear were straightening. For the first time in weeks, some of the men were smiling. Private Willie Reed sat nearby, tears streaming down his face as he ate, making no effort to hide them. James Turner ate slowly, deliberately, as if trying to make each bite last as long as possible. Marcus Johnson had his eyes closed, chewing thoughtfully, lost in his own memories of home. These were men who had seen things no man should see, who had done things they would carry forever, who lived each day knowing it might be their last. And here they were, eating turkey in the rain, remembering what it felt like to be human. Sergeant Washington stood and tapped his canteen cup against his mess kit, the metal ringing out. The men looked up. He spoke then about remembering this day, not because of the food, but because of what they'd been through to get here. Because of the men who weren't with them anymore. Private Johnson, who died taking that ridge last week. Corporal Matthews, who bled out before the medics could reach them. All the boys from Fort Huachuca who didn't make it this far. The men were silent now, forks still. Washington's voice was steady but strained as he spoke about fighting a war on two fronts, fighting the Germans in those hills, fighting their own country every single day, fighting to be seen as men, to be treated with dignity, for the right to sit at a table and eat a meal without somebody telling them they didn't belong. Isaiah felt the weight of those words settle over the clearing like the mist that clung to the mountains. Every man there knew the truth of it. They'd all experienced the double burden of serving a nation that didn't serve them back. They'd all felt the bitter irony of fighting for freedom while denied it themselves. Isaiah looked around at the faces of his brothers, unarmed. Willie Reed, who'd picked cotton in Mississippi and now picked off German machine gunners with his rifle. Marcus Johnson, who'd built cars in Detroit and now built defensive positions under fire. James Turner, who'd been a school teacher in North Carolina and now taught new replacements how to survive. Each man carried his own story, his own scars, his own reasons for being here. Washington spoke about giving thanks, not for the country that sent them here while treating them like they were less than human, not for the generals who blamed them when they were outgunned and outmanned, but for each other, for the man to your left and the man to your right, for the brother who shares his rations when yours run out, for the soldier who pulls you out of the line of fire, for the sergeant who keeps you alive one more day. He raised his canteen cup high above his head, water droplets falling from its rim. The Buffalo Soldiers, the 92nd, to us. The men raised their cups, their voices joining together in a chorus that echoed off the mountain walls. They drank, and then they ate, and for a little while the war seemed far away. The quartermaster corps sergeant came around with a clipboard, checking off names, making sure every man got his meal. He was a heavy-set man from Philadelphia, with kind eyes and hands scarred from years of labor. When he reached Isaiah, he paused. He'd heard about what happened up at Samacalonia, he said. Heard they'd taken heavy casualties. Isaiah nodded. Samacalonia. They'd taken the village in October, held it against German counterattacks for weeks. The fighting had been brutal, house to house, room to room. He'd killed 3 men there, shooting them at close range, watching them fall. He still saw their faces when he closed his eyes. The sergeant's voice lowered. He knew what they were going through out here, he said, knew how they were treated. He'd seen German prisoners eating in the mess hall while their own boys had to wait outside. Seen white officers getting medals for battles colored soldiers fought. It wasn't right, none of it was right. But he wanted Isaiah to know something. He looked around at the men gathered under the tarps, eating their Thanksgiving dinner in the rain. They were heroes, every single one of them. And someday people would know that. Someday they would tell the story of the Buffalo Soldiers and what they did here. Isaiah wanted to believe that too, but he'd learned not to count on someday. After the meal, the men had an hour to themselves before returning to the line. Some wrote letters home, though no one knew when mail would go out. Some cleaned their weapons, a soldier's ritual, finding comfort in the familiar motions. Some just sat in silence, savoring the feeling of a full stomach. Isaiah found himself standing at the edge of the clearing, looking down the mountain toward the valley where the Germans waited. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and in the distance he could see smoke rising from a burning farmhouse. He thought about the Italian families caught between armies, their homes destroyed, their lives shattered by a war they didn't start. Sergeant Washington came to stand beside him. They stood in silence for a long moment, 2 soldiers looking out at the landscape of war. Washington spoke quietly about home, about his children. His little girl was 7 now. He'd missed 2 of her birthdays. His boy was 5. Probably didn't even remember what his father looked like. Isaiah asked the question that had been burning in him for months. Would it be different after the war? Would they be treated better? Washington sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. He didn't know. He hoped so. But hope was a dangerous thing in this line of work. What he did know was this. They were writing a story here. Every battle they fought, every hill they took, every time they proved the doubters wrong, they were writing a story. And that story would outlive all of them. Behind them, the men of C Company were gathering their gear, preparing to move back to their positions. The hour of grace was ending. The war was waiting. But then something happened that no one expected. A jeep came roaring up the mountain road, sliding in the mud, spraying water. It skidded to a stop in the clearing, and a white lieutenant jumped out, his uniform pristine, his face flushed with urgency. He demanded to see Captain Henderson, thrust a paper at him when the captain emerged from the command tent. Orders from division. The colored troops were to vacate this area immediately. General Alman wanted this position reinforced with the 442nd Combat Team, the Nisei Boys. The Buffalo soldiers were being moved to a secondary position. Effective immediately, a shock went through the company. Men stood frozen, their mess kits still in their hands. Henderson protested, said they'd been holding this ground for 6 weeks, knew every inch of this terrain. The lieutenant glanced at his watch. Orders were orders. They had 2 hours to clear out. The 442nd was moving up tonight. The lieutenant got back in his jeep and drove away, leaving a stunned silence behind him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Willie Reed threw his mess kit on the ground, the metal clanging against stone. His voice shook when he spoke about the perfect timing of it all. Give them a turkey dinner and then kick them out of their own position. This was what they always got. Marcus Johnson's face was hard as stone. The division didn't trust them. Never did. Never would. They bled for this ground, and headquarters was giving it to somebody else. Washington said quietly that the 442nd were good soldiers, but Willie wasn't having it. He didn't care if they were the best soldiers in the whole army. That wasn't the point. The point was the brass thought they couldn't hold this position. The point was they thought the Buffalo soldiers weren't good enough. Washington snapped at him to watch his mouth, but there was no real heat in it. He was angry too. They could all see it in the tightness of his jaw, the way his hands kept clenching and unclenching. Captain Henderson stood in the middle of the clearing, the orders still in his hand, looking lost. Isaiah felt something cold settle in his chest. It wasn't surprised. You couldn't really be surprised when the world confirmed what you'd always known, but it hurt anyway. It hurt like a knife between the ribs. They'd given them a turkey dinner. They'd given them 1 hour to feel like human beings, to feel like their service mattered. And then they'd taken it all away. Washington finally spoke, his voice cutting through the murmur of anger and disbelief. They had their orders. Time to pack up and move out. James Turner asked where they were moving to. Some quiet sector where they wouldn't embarrass anybody. Some supply depot where they could load trucks. Washington's answer was simple and hard. They moved where they were told. That's what soldiers do. But Isaiah could see it in the sergeant's eyes. The betrayal, the weariness, the knowledge that no matter how hard they fought, no matter how much they gave, it would never be enough. They would always be the Buffalo soldiers, the colored troops, the ones who couldn't quite measure up. The men began to pack their gear, moving slowly, mechanically. The quartermaster corps troops started breaking down the field kitchen, loading the empty pots onto the trucks. The turkey dinner was over. Thanksgiving was over. Isaiah stood at the edge of the clearing and looked one last time at the valley below, at the ground they'd held, at the hills they'd bled for. He thought about Private Johnson, who'd died on that ridge, about Corporal Matthews, who'd held the line until his last breath, about all the men who'd given everything. For what? For a country that served them turkey and then told them they weren't good enough to hold the ground they'd won. But then Sergeant Washington's voice cut through his thoughts, calling the men to form up one last time. Williams, Turner, Johnson, Reed. The men of C Company gathered in the clearing, and Washington stood at the center, his back straight, his voice carrying across the rain-soaked ground. Acknowledged what they were feeling. Anger, betrayal. He felt it too. But headquarters could move them, could send them wherever they wanted, could treat them like they didn't matter. What they couldn't take was what the Buffalo soldiers had done. Couldn't take those 6 weeks they held this line. Couldn't take the men they saved or the battles they won. Couldn't take who they were. Washington walked along the line of soldiers, his boots squelching in the mud. They were the Buffalo soldiers. They were the 92nd Infantry Division. And they would continue to fight, not because this country deserved it, but because their brothers deserved it. Because the man next to you deserves to go home. Because the next generation of colored folks deserves to live in a world where they're not always last, always forgotten, always told they're not enough. He stopped and faced them. They would pack their gear, march to wherever headquarters sent them, keep fighting, not for the brass, for themselves, for each other. Because that's what soldiers do, that's what men do. And nobody, not even the United States Army, could tell them they weren't men. The rain had stopped. For the first time in days, the clouds were breaking, and a shaft of weak sunlight fell across the clearing, illuminating the faces of the soldiers. They stood there, these men who'd been told their whole lives they were less, that they were inferior, that they didn't belong. And they stood proud. Isaiah felt something shift inside him. The anger was still there. The hurt was still there, but beneath it, something else. Something harder. A determination that felt like iron. Willie Reed spoke then, his voice carrying a new resolve. They would make their own Thanksgiving, right here, right now, make it mean what they wanted it to mean. Marcus Johnson agreed. They'd been given turkey, but they would give themselves something headquarters couldn't take away. Washington smiled. It was a sad smile, but it was real. They formed a circle in the clearing, these soldiers of the 92nd, muddy and exhausted and betrayed, but standing together. One by one, they spoke their gratitude. Turner was thankful for Washington, who'd kept them alive. Johnson was thankful for C Company, for his brothers. Reed was thankful he was still breathing and thankful for every German they'd sent to hell. They went around the circle, each man speaking his truth. When it came to Isaiah, he had to clear his throat before he could speak. He was thankful for this moment, he said, for standing here with them all, for knowing that even when everything else was taken from them, they still had this, they still had each other. When the last man had spoken, Washington raised his hand and spoke one final time. He wanted them to remember this day, November 23rd, 1944. The day they had Thanksgiving in the rain. The day headquarters tried to break them and they stood together instead. Someday, when this war was over, when they were home with their families, when they were old men, they would tell this story, and people would know. They would know what the Buffalo Soldiers did. They would know who they were. Then they moved out, leaving the clearing behind, marching through the mud toward their new position. The field kitchen trucks rumbled away down the mountain. The canvas tarps were rolled up and packed. By the time the 442nd arrived, there would be no sign that the Buffalo Soldiers had been there at all, except for the ground they'd held and the blood they'd shed. Isaiah walked with his rifle slung over his shoulder, his mess kit tied to his pack, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. Around him, his brothers marched in silence, their faces set, their eyes forward. They were moving to a new position, a secondary position, the place where they kept soldiers they didn't quite trust. But they were moving together. And in the end, Isaiah thought maybe that was all that mattered. Not the turkey dinner or the orders or the betrayal. Not the racism or the segregation or the 1,000 daily humiliations. But this, the knowledge that when everything else was stripped away, when the world told them they were nothing, they had each other. They were the Buffalo Soldiers. They were the 92nd Infantry Division. They had celebrated Thanksgiving in the rain on a mountain in Italy, far from home, fighting for a country that didn't love them back. But they had celebrated together, and no one could take that away. The rain began again as they marched, cold and steady, washing away their footprints, washing away the evidence of their presence. Behind them, the hill they'd held for 6 weeks stood silent in the gathering darkness. Ahead, the war continued, grinding on toward some distant end they couldn't see, a conclusion that seemed to recede with every step they took. Isaiah thought about his mother's prayer, about his sister's grace, about the hope that he would come home. He thought about Sergeant Washington's words, that they were writing a story that someday people would know. He thought about the faces of the men marching beside him, each one a testament to courage and endurance. He didn't know if he believed it, but he knew this: he was still here. He was still fighting. He was still standing. And on this Thanksgiving Day in 1944, that was enough.